After 3 rounds in the Biel Grandmaster tournament, Magnus Carlsen shared the lead with Shahriar Mamedyarov, both players on 2.5 out of 3. In round 4, Carlsen faced Nico Georgiadis, who'd had a disastrous start, losing all 3 games. So naturally, Carlsen wanted to target the weakest player in the tournament. Nico Georgiadis is a Grandmaster, but he's only rated 25-26, and that's 540th in the world. So Carlsen really wanted to go for it today. Let's see what happens. E4 from Georgiadis, and Carlsen played the French. So something different again. And here, not the classical. Actually, Carlsen rarely plays the French, but he has played the classical, beat Karyakin in a really nice game. But today, the winner, and not just the winner, but a sideline with Bishop A5. Now, this has been played, this is a very old variation, for example, played in the Smyslov-Botvinnik World Championship match in 1954. I'm sure you remember it well. It's also a speciality of some Armenian players such as Raphael Vaganyan and Laputian, and also from a couple of Swiss players as well. Werner Hug, for example, former World Junior Champion, he specializes in it. And I think that has a bearing on this game. And Nico played b4. This is the best move. I think this was first discovered by Alikin. The idea is that after pawn takes pawn, the knight comes to b5, and then c3, and the knight is ready to check, and also bishop a3 is coming soon as well. White has absolutely fantastic compensation. That's why black plays pawn takes pawn. And now queen g4. You can play knight b5, but queen g4 is one of the main moves. And now, well, there's a famous game between Fischer and Tal, played in the Leipzig Olympiad 1960, that went knight e7. And, well, this was a short and very complicated game that finally ended in a draw. You can see that in Fischer's 60 memorable games. But instead of that, knight e7, the normal move, king f8 played by Carlsen very quickly, obviously preparation. But actually, Nico wasn't fazed by this at all. He played knight b5. Incidentally, Fischer actually, I discovered in the database, Fischer has actually had this game in a simultaneous display, and Fischer took on a5 here. But Nico played knight b5, played it very quickly, and it turns out that Nico had actually had this variation on his analysis board about a month ago. And as I said, this variation, the whole variation, is actually played in Switzerland. So perhaps Nico was already quite familiar with the ideas. Perhaps Carlsen picked the wrong one. Carlsen said after the game that he gambled with this opening variation, but got caught red-handed. Bishop dropped c7, and now there was a game between Fedoseev and Mamedyarov which went queen g3 here, and Carlsen cited that game as the reason why he thought he'd try this out. But yeah, I mean, he admitted it was a gamble and didn't pay off, because Nico played the best move here, queen takes d4, covering the e5 pawn and ready to swipe this one. And that's what happened. Knight c6, queen check, and now he took the opportunity to exchange off that really important dark squared bishop. Now this is a very strange position, because although white's development is practically non-existent apart from the queen, in fact, because of the really poor position of the king on f8, black can't really exploit this. And the queen even does a reasonable job in slowing down black's development, because there's a threat to play b5, pinning and winning. So Carlsen pushed the queen away. And here Carlsen said afterwards he just thought that queen c3 was a good move, holding the center, followed by bishop d3 and castles, and said white's better. But Nico thought for over half an hour in this position. He doesn't manage his time very well. Thought for half an hour and played queen d6, and he'd spotted a very interesting idea. Carlsen exchanged and played knight f5. Now, if black can take that pawn, then he must be winning. So this is a very double-edged way to play the position. And now f6. Again, white is on the edge, because if e5 comes, followed by knight d6, it's practically game over. But here is where Nico had seen a very clever idea. So he must act quickly, and he played g4. So the knight came into d4. This was exchanged off. And then white castled on the queen side. So e5 is the move, of course, to support the knight, but also attack the bishop. And then black will try to round up this pawn, but also the bishop threatens the pawn. It looks dire for white, but here is where Georgiadis had prepared this exchange sacrifice. And this is very unclear indeed. White has two very dangerous bishops, a strong passed pawn on d6 protected by this bishop, and perhaps the potential to bring the rook into the position. And with these split rooks, this is actually a perilous situation for black. So the game went bishop takes g4, rook e1, and now there's not a lot that can stop the rook coming down here. I asked Magnus after the game whether he thought perhaps bishop e6 was playable instead, so that after rook e1 the bishop can just be protected and that stops the rook entering into the position. But he thought simply rook d1 followed by taking here would be a decent idea. There's also g5, and white has pretty good compensation with the bishop pair. Coming back here, bishop takes g4. So rook e1, the rook enters the position in a moment. Now rook d8, we'll see the purpose of this in a second, and rook e7. Well, I mean, at a glance one can see that white has very good compensation here, because the rooks simply don't coordinate. They're split, and well, all white pieces and that beautiful pawn on d6 coordinating so well. But here was Magnus's idea, h5. So he wants to drive the bishop away and take the pawn on d6. And here this Nico played h4. He could have played f4 here. I wonder if that's perhaps a better move. So this would give up the pawn on d6. But with those bishops, white still has very good compensation, and of course the rook as well. That is not an easy position for black to play. I mean, I don't think black is worse, but white certainly has good compensation. But h4 played instead, and now here's Magnus's idea that after taking, of course, if bishop takes pawn, then rook takes pawn on d6. So bishop f4, and now Magnus thought afterwards that perhaps he should have played a5 just to save a pawn and to exchange off pawns here. He thought that might have been less dangerous. Said he played bishop f5. In fact, I don't think bishop f5 is a mistake. Rook takes pawn played. And now here Magnus played rook h7, and perhaps that's inaccurate. Rook c8 looks like the move, just threatening to take on c2. And this is just a really double-edged position, but it does seem as though it's actually turning in black's favor. So let's go back. Rook h7, well, also looks pretty reasonable, because I'm sure Magnus was desperate to bring this sidelined rook into the game. But then came rook c7, and here again I think Magnus was a bit thrown by this, or something along here. He played bishop d7, looks a bit odd to self-pin. Perhaps king g8 would have been a stronger move, but I mean, this is such a complicated position, and the idea is that finally this rook can enter into the game, perhaps down here, perhaps giving a check. Oops, giving a check down on g1. But who knows, perhaps just exchanging and pushing here. Those bishops control important squares, preventing the h-pawn rolling forward, and well, obviously white has compensation here. But instead, anyway, bishop d7 played by Carlsen, and it looks a bit odd to self-pin, and he admitted afterwards that he'd totally overlooked bishop c6 with the idea of just taking here. h3 played by Carlsen, king d2 coming up the board, and now, well, perhaps king e8 is stronger, but white still has tremendous compensation. Instead, Carlsen played rook g7, which allows bishop h6, but I mean, Carlsen said afterwards he just wanted to simplify the position. And now if h2, then bishop takes d5 is best, just preventing the pawn queening. But that wasn't Carlsen's intention. He played bishop takes c6. I should say that Nico Georgiadis was already approaching time pressure here. Magnus was something like an hour ahead on the clock. So Magnus gives back material, but at least he's managed to capture that important pawn in the middle of the board. But Nico now played excellently. So there wasn't a better discovered check. Let me just show you this. If rook d7, check, king moves away, takes, and h2, followed by getting a queen here. So rook g5, best move, and that means that white can actually take well, both pawns, because bishop d7 is actually quite risky for black. There's a chance that white is actually going to be better in this position, because the rook doesn't have any problems taking care of this pawn, and perhaps the king can march up to take this. Well, certainly bishop f4 looks like a strong move, actually, attacking the rook, and yeah, then we take the pawn on d5. The h-pawn is under control, but well, these remaining pawns are quite weak. So Magnus played instead of keeping hold of that pawn on h3, he played bishop b5. This was taken, and he's wanting to get in on e2. I thought in this phase of the game it was actually remarkable that Magnus somehow managed to create a few problems, at least keep the game alive. It looked for a moment as though this was just leveling out very quickly, but he found an extraordinary idea. First of all, a little couple of checks, and now f5. This looks like a bizarre idea, but it's actually intending to meet white's threat of simplifying with c3, because then f4, now the bishop can go to h4, but if that's taken, then check, and the rook takes the bishop on f4. That's the basic idea. So after f5, Georgiadis made room for his bishop to drop to f2 to take here, which looks absolutely fine, and it seems as though white is just coasting towards a draw again, because, well, black is tied to defending this pawn, and you want to play c3. So c3 is what happened, and now Magnus found an amazing idea. We were all anticipating the exchange here and d4, and that's just a level endgame. But instead, Magnus found this move rook c6. Incredible idea. So that if bishop takes pawn check, you can see the rook on d3 is trapped. So Nico played rook takes d4, but that gives black's rook time to dash over here to attack. And just for a moment, white is poorly coordinated because the rook just stands very badly on d4. So after the time control, when it looked as though Nico had survived the worst, suddenly he found himself in a slightly tricky situation. He still had some work to do here. King c1, rook c3. So Magnus manages to take the pawn on f3, but actually those last couple of moves have allowed white to bring the bishop into the center and to coordinate well. And actually Nico played the best moves here. And in this position, yeah, this is absolutely fine for white. He shouldn't move away, because then rook takes bishop and then the pawn looks extremely dangerous. But rook takes rook. And he took on b6. Now bishop a4, that at least prevents white moving up with the king and playing a4. But this position is actually a draw. Let me show you how. So if the king dives in to help the pawn, then c4 is just drawing very easily. Like this, a4 comes, and the pawns just get exchanged. That's just a draw. But Magnus continued to fiddle around here, looking for a way in. In fact, white can just wait here, and there's no big deal. There's just one little trick. If bishop d4, then this is possible, because after c4 you can play king d3, attacking both bishop and pawn. So Nico just has to avoid that, so he played bishop a7. And now c4. If pawn takes, we've already seen this variation. White is fine. But Magnus, well, had a little joke at the end. d4. Bishop has to move, and king takes c4. And obviously, this blockade on a4 and b5 can't be lifted. And the players agree to draw here. So just another tremendous fight. And, well, I mean, it's very hard to determine exactly what was going on in this game, but probably Magnus missed a chance to, well, at least play for a win in a kind of meaningful way. As for Nico, hard to say. I mean, I think he played a really enterprising game. It was a really enterprising sacrifice. Was he ever better? I don't think so. But he certainly posed some very tricky questions for Magnus. So, a bit of an upset, but of course delighted for Nico Georgiadis, who puts his mark on the scoreboard with a draw. Anyway, after 4 rounds, there are still 2 leaders at the top of the tournament, Magnus Carlsen and Shahriar Mamedyarov with 3 points. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. It's free to subscribe, and on the PowerPlayChess YouTube channel. And stick around for more videos. Round 5 coming soon.